Hello, this is Psycho Sabor, and what I want to do is go through a tip of the day involving one of my PowerShell scripts. And this is the PowerShell script I use to identify certain types of files in a media library. I was actually asked to do this not too long ago to audit a set of file types in a media library that they wanted to track and make sure that they should still be using those files. So I wanted to give them a list rather than force them to go through the media library to find those files, because particularly if they're not sure where to look, it could be take quite a while to go through the entire media library, find those files to begin with, and then be able to take a look and audit them. So I decided to create a PowerShell script to help them find them, and I want to use this video to describe that PowerShell script as well as demonstrate the results I got out of it. But before I do, I want to go into the media library, which is where I am, and upload two PDF files, which I myself will then be able to identify in the results as part of this video. So I am on my XM Cloud version of Sitecore. I went directly to the media library from the desktop. And the two PDFs I uploaded are these two in my files folder. So one is the letter from Birmingham written by Martin Luther King Jr., and the other one is a hotel reservation. Nothing to do with each other. These were just the two that I had handy that I decided to upload into Sitecore. Okay, but besides wanting to upload two files that I can actually track, um, one of the things I wanted to demonstrate is that when you upload a PDF file into the media library, because Sitecore knows what this file type is, it has a specific template that the media library uses to store PDFs in the media library. And the name of the template happens to be PDF under Unversioned and Media. It has a specific GUID, this template does, and it's the same GUID used on every version of Sitecore. So the good news is once you create this code, you could import it on any version of Sitecore you like, because I doubt that this template ID has changed in quite a while. Okay. All right, and that's the case with mostly anything loaded to the media library. If Sitecore is able to identify the type of file, particularly if it's an image or a video file, it should have a specific template designed to address it. Otherwise, if it doesn't, it uses a generic file template. And that's typically used for any file type loaded into the media library that it's not able to associate with a particular type of file. But in any event, as part of my code, I want to grab files that are using specific template types associated with assets loaded into the media library, and then include that in my list. Okay, so to access that particular tool through which I can run my PowerShell script, I'm going to go to the icon for the desktop in Sitecore, go to Development Tools, and access PowerShell ISC. Now, in the past, I know that in order to do this, PowerShell extensions had to be installed on your Sitecore instance, but I believe these days PowerShell is just a part of the uh, backbone of Sitecore now, so you don't have to install PowerShell extensions as a additional function of Sitecore. But in previous versions, I believe before 9, you would have to install PowerShell extensions separately, and this would be one of the tools that's available, so you can run a PowerShell script in your Sitecore environment. I'm going to go ahead and click on it, and if I do, it launches the PowerShell ISC window. Now, there's already a script in here, and the deal is when you copy and paste a script into the upper pane, it stays in there until someone replaces it with a different PowerShell script. And I've already preloaded it with the one I used to create this list for me using PowerShell. In the upper pane, you would either create or copy and paste in a PowerShell script you wish to run. And then the lower pane, if you have elements in your code that generates output, that will show up in the lower pane. For example, I have one or two write host commands, and write host in PowerShell means exactly what it says. It's going to write to the host. So whatever I tell it to write, it's going to show up in this blue area. So whether it be for testing or just to record the output of what the PowerShell script is doing, or to generate some response I can then track, I would use write host quite a bit. In this particular example, I just have it for two specific reasons, and that's it. Otherwise, there's not much spit out into this area, which is fine. Just depends on what you want your PowerShell script to do. But I'm pretty sure that when I did testing, I did have a couple of right hosts in there to let me know how far into the code it got to. Okay, so without further ado, let me talk about what this PowerShell script is doing. After all, that's what the blog was about. And then I'll actually run the PowerShell script so you could see what results you will get. Okay, so remember that the goal here is that I want to create a PowerShell script to help me audit certain file types in the media library that I either want to hold on to, maybe get rid of, or at least know where they are in my media library without combing through the media library one element at a time. So as good as the content tree is, if you look for something specific, it could be difficult. All right. So my first step was to identify the media library as a parent item, and that's what I did with this first line. In the next three lines, as I mentioned before, items in the media library are stored under a template which is used to create the item. And those tend to be hard-coded or they just come out of the box that way in Sitecore. And as you saw earlier, some of the items I want to identify are PDF files, and they come with a specific template ID, which has always been associated with that type of item in the media library. So here I'm copying that GUID. I'm also want to track generic files that may be in the media library, so I create a variable to track that GUID. And then the last one is for a Word document that might be in the media library, and that's the GUID for that one. And there's probably about a dozen to 15 different template IDs for all sorts of items you could store in the media library. Okay. In my next step, I have a couple of variables here. Output is going to be where I collect the entire list of items in my media library that I'm targeting. I do have a counter to keep count. And then I create a record, which in its own sense is an array, before I push it into the output array. So in the end, the output is an array of records. And in each record, which is an array in its own right, I collect some information about the file before I add it to the output array. And you'll see more of that code as we continue further. The next thing I do is that I actually grab the item represented by the parent item that I'm pointing to in the parent item path. Remember that my parent item path is the Sitecore Media Library path. So with this step, I'm actually grabbing the media library item. And I do check to make sure that I actually have it. Now, if it's something like the media library, I would expect that this would never be null because that comes out of Sitecore out of the box. But if I set this parent item to some subset under the media library, then I do want to check to make sure that it's an actual item, and this is the check. So if it's null, what it's going to write to the lower half screen is that the parent item was never found, and then at that point it would stop. The next step is I'm going to use access get descendants to grab all the children of the parent item. This access get descendants, if memory serves, is part of Sitecore query, which comes preloaded with Sitecore. It's great if you don't have too many items. Otherwise, if you have a ton of items, there are other functions available in PowerShell that you can use to iterate through those items. I'm anticipating that there are not that many items in the media library, so access get descendants will work for me, and it grabs every descendant item of the parents, which in this case would be everything in the media library. If for some reason there are no children there, not so much under the media library per se, but if my parent item was a subfolder under the media library and I wasn't sure there were items there, this will allow me to make that check. If there are no items, then I get my second write host command, which says no children were found, and then it stops. Okay, but assuming they're children, then this for each loop goes through each individual child. And for each child, I check the template ID to see if it matches the PDF template one, the file template one, or the docs template one that I have defined above. Because if it's not one of those three items, I don't care to evaluate it. I'm just going to skip over it. Bear in mind that the media library has other file types like images and videos, which I don't want to use for this code. It also has a bunch of subfolders. If I go back to the media library, there's a lot of subfolders here under the media library folder itself. And it's my way of saying I want to skip over those. I'm not interested in the folders. I'm not looking for images. I'm not looking for videos, just specific file types. This will allow me, if the file type is not one of those templates, it skips over the child item. Otherwise, it then continues. Okay. In my next step, I decide to use a switch statement. So the idea behind the switch statement is that I look at the template ID of the child item and I evaluate if it's the PDF one, the file one, or the document one. If it's the PDF one, I then create a record. And for that record, which is a new object, what's in this array is the GUID of the child item in question, the full path so I can find it in the media library by path if I wish, and the name of the item if that's all I'm looking for. And to make it clear it's a PDF, I declare a variable called file type within this array whose value is simply PDF. If it's based on the file template ID, similar type of record except I set the file type to file. If it's a Word document, I collect similar information except I set the file type to document. So at this point, I've created a record based on what template is actually in use. After I create the record, I then add it to the output array, and then I take a count. So I am counting how many elements are in my array. Now, one of the reasons I do this is because as part of my testing, I don't necessarily want to go through all the records just yet. As part of my testing, I actually test a subset to make sure that my subset, through the subset, everything looks right. So rather than look at every record it can come back with, I just want to look at 5 through this test. And if I do this correctly through the 5, then I'll expand it to do all the records that I can get my hands on. But first I tested it with 5 to make sure if for those 5 records everything looks the way it should, I'm getting the right information, and I'm not getting any errors. So to give you an example of what that looks like, I'll actually remove the parts of my code that comment this out, which for PowerShell involves greater than symbols, less than symbols, and the hashtag. And I'm actually going to put them around the actual output that gives me the entire list. Okay, so now this code is available. If I execute it now, I'm only going to get 5 records. And here they are. And note that for each record, I get the GUID, which was one of the things I wanted, the full path of the item if I want to navigate to it through the media library, the name of the item if I'm just interested in that, and whether it's a file, a PDF, or a Word document. The first 5 items it came across that was using one of those 3 templates all happen to be files, which is fine. But this gives me the opportunity to see that my code does not error out and to see what it returns with when it hits those 5 records. If I'm satisfied with this, I can just close this and then expose this for all the records. Otherwise, if I see any problems, this would be the time where once I close out this file, I would go back to my code and take a closer look. Now, let's see here. If I can minimize this for a second, and I can, notice that what's generating that modal is the show list view function. So I take my output array that contains those 5 records. Using a pipe, I pass it into this function. And for each record, I am exposing the GUID, the full path, the name of the item, and the file type I assigned to it just a couple of steps ago. Okay, so for each record, you assign it these variables, GUID, path, name, and file type. In show list view, I expose them with this part of the syntax that's at the end. The first part of the syntax, I'm just giving each column a name. They just happen to be the same as the name of the variable I assigned it. That's coincidence, though on purpose, because I just couldn't come up with a different name at the time. But that's how you could set up the column names followed by the name of the value you want to extract from each subarray. And if I go back to the modal, that's why you see them up here at the top of each column. Note that for this list, if I wanted to, I can pass that out export it in a variety of different file formats. I can actually email it, or pass it out as XML or JSON or HTML if I'm just going to paste it on a web page. Or I can export it to Excel if I'm just going to manually analyze the results, and I've done that before quite a bit. Or I might use a CSV if I'm going to pass it into another system that's going to evaluate the results. So it's not going to be manual. Another program or function is just going to pick it up and do whatever it's going to do with it. So it's very common to use a CSV since Excel has formatting. Okay, but that's how this works. So if I'm happy with the way this looks, I can click on the X to close it. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to comment it out again using the hashtag and the proper greater than or less than symbol. And then I want to uncomment the actual output for all the records. And now it's ready to go. All right, something else I'll talk about briefly is that while I'm testing, if I want to make sure I have this right, I would debug through it. And one of the ways to debug, or the way to debug, is this debug function right here. The first thing I would do is set a breakpoint somewhere, and you could do that by just clicking next to the number of the line of code where you want it to stop. Set as many breakpoints as you want, right? And then if you click on debug, it will run your program or your script, but then it will stop at the first breakpoint. And then once it stops at a breakpoint, I could point to a variable and see what it's collecting, if it's collecting anything at all. And this way I have a better chance of analyzing whether the results it's getting make sense based on the code I try to write. I have the ability to step into, step out, or step over, depending on how I want to progress in my code. For instance, if I do a step into, it just goes to the next line, and then I can look at that variable to see what it's collecting. Otherwise, if I'm ready to go to the next breakpoint, I would just click on continue. And now it stops on where my next breakpoint is. Now I am inside of a for each loop, so if I click on continue again, it's going to hit the same breakpoint again because now it's on the next line of the loop or the next child item in that loop. So it is one of the ways I would do it to, it does mean progressing quite a few times through the for each loop, but it is a way for me to go through it if I just want to double check which record it's looking at and whether it's evaluating the record correctly. So I do a lot of these things when I start running scripts in PowerShell to make sure that the PowerShell works the way it's supposed to. And it's important to be careful with PowerShell script in Sitecore because you are actually manipulating the items in your content tree. So particularly if they're changing those items, you want to carefully test to make sure that the changes you're expecting are the ones that are created so that you don't create changes that would be difficult to back out. So it's always a good idea is to create a test set of items if that's necessary, and then step through your code, make sure that it's doing the things to those items that you expect it to. Thankfully, this piece of code doesn't actually change any items, but I still want to be careful and make sure that it returns with the items I'm expecting. But especially since I'm using a for each loop, I certainly don't want to create a scenario where it gets stuck in the for each loop and can't get out. And then as a result, someone has to reboot my Sitecore instance in order for it to get it to stop because now it's taking up resources running my code. So it's always a good idea to be careful. Put in coding steps that allows you to stop your code at certain breakpoints so that you can evaluate the results, get out of it successfully, and then make sure that the results you're getting make sense. For instance, note that in my test code here, I have a break here so that when I do get my 5 records, I tell it to stop running the code so that if there's anything that might cause it to keep going into a loop, I stop the loop here, I can analyze the results and feel comfortable that when I run it the next time, it's not going to be in an endless loop. So all things you can do to make sure your code is running correctly. I'm going to go ahead and click on stop because then when I do, it stops debugging. Okay, so if I'm comfortable with my code working, then what I could do is click on execute and run the code. And when I do, I get my show list view modal. Here it is. I have 751 records. If you look in the lower left, made up of 31 pages, meaning each screen that's on this modal, where you can go to the first record, the last record, or transverse through the screens, or pages, I should say, using the previous and next arrow buttons. but I want to see if my PDFs are in this list. And if I type in PDF in the filter and hit enter, here are my 2 PDFs. So I know that they've made the list and my code is working just fine. If I backspace it out and hit enter again, I get the entire list back. So this looks great. So now I feel comfortable that I can use this script to take an audit of certain file types that are in my media library, and then based on this audit, decide what I want to do with the items I no longer want to keep, or that I do want to keep, or whatever I feel for the items that are currently in my media library. And then that's all there is to it. So I hope this video was useful and that you enjoyed what I discussed in addition to reading my blog. If you go to my blog, you gain access directly to the code that I just described and make use fit for your own needs. So I hope you found this useful, and I can't wait to see you at the next video. Take care.